Welcome to the Marvel Snap Meta Report, where we're looking at the best decks in the game right now, according to the data. However, a little bonus is that I've built my favorite version of each of these decks to showcase, as well as showing you some versions with High Evolutionary and without, because of course that is a very popular card in the meta right now that only around 50% of the player base own. We've had the introduction of Kitty Pryde as well as Nebula as two very strong cards which have been shaping the meta, and of course a lot of nerfs to some of the previously best performing decks. Things like Shuri are no longer big threats, but we do still have Dark Hawk, Black Bolt doing the rounds despite it getting nerfed pretty heavily. The first deck and the best performing deck according to the data between the ranks of 70 to 99 is Sera Control. This deck has always had a whole bunch of different ways to build it, and I've got two that I'm going to suggest to you. My top pick for this one is looking like this. Bast is the money card in these decks. I would absolutely always recommend playing it. Now, this one has Zabu and Absorbing Man, and the only difference is the other one has Luke Cage and Hazmat instead of those two cards. Now, the Luke Cage Hazmat version has been doing the rounds for a long time, and I've never been a big believer in it. Luke Cage does have a little bit of synergy with Bast, because your Enchantress and your Sera are going to be getting set to, well, they're not going to be getting set to 3 power, so you're not losing points there. So it's already playing for a little bit there. Of course, it has Hazmat synergy. However, with the amount of high evolutionaries doing the rounds right now, Luke Cage is, of course, a great tech card and a great way of beating those decks. So I think this is going to be my preferred version for right now. But if you're not a big fan of the Luke Cage and Hazmat combo, something like this with the Zabu and the Absorbing Man could be a different option for you. Kitty Pryde and Angela combo is just phenomenal. Hitmonkey is brilliant. Being able to play a 1-cost card like Kitty Pryde alongside Killmonger is a really huge deal for this one. And Kitty Pryde really replacing Sentinel in these decks. Sentinel was in there, not because it was very good, but just as a way of spending energy while still having cards in your hand. Because of course you can't play Sunspot like a deck usually would when Killmonger is so crucial to this deck. I think this deck is looking very, very solid. Both versions are going to be great. There's so many different ways you can build it. This one here with Scarlet Witch is also very solid. I just don't think you need Kitty Pryde and Sentinel. I think therefore if you cut Sentinel, you want to cut the Nova. And I've never, ever been a believer in Scarlet Witch in these decks. Scarlet Witch doesn't see any play in any other deck. So why are people so insistent on playing it in Sera Control? It does my nothing. Don't play Scarlet Witch. It's average. Anyway, moving on to the second best performing deck with a 54% win rate, which is much higher, and it's a Control lockdown deck. My favorite archetype in Marvel Snap, apart from movement, historically anyway. Now, why has this deck got a higher win rate but a lower average cube rate? Well, that's because Professor X and Spider-Man are kings of winning 2 or 4 cubes, but not very good at winning those 8 cube games. There's a couple ways of playing this. There is the high evolutionary version, which I definitely think is a lot better, but I'm also going to be showing you my favorite version of this deck without. Sunspot and Nebula, just extraordinary cards right now, particularly with cards like with Storm and with Professor X. Armor could be a consideration for this one if Killmonger becomes very, very popular. That's going to help you against Sera Control, that's for sure. So certainly you could play Armor in this one, and Titania would be the card that goes. Titania has a lot of synergy here with Daredevil, because of course on turn 5 you want to play Professor X or Spider-Man. What you can actually do with Daredevil down on the board is you can play Spider-Man, Titania, and Wasp. So you Spider-Man one location, locking them out, and then if your opponent has 3 cards into a different location, you can play Titania first, and then the Wasp, which is then going to move Titania to your opponent's side, locking them out of 2 locations on turn number 5. And if you've already played Storm, that just means you're going to win the game on the spot. The other cards in here then is High Evolutionary. This is giving you the Wasp, which is already quite good in this deck with Storm. A 3-point card into your Storm lane is really great. You've got Cyclops, which works as an engine in the Storm lane. If you don't spend any energy, of course, you're going to be inflicting 2 points of damage, if you like, to your opponent's side. And then you've got the big point slam Hulk as well. Dr. Doom in this one. I do think Doom is a little bit overrated in these decks because often you just want to slam the Hulk anyway. But this deck's just really, really solid. Been seeing it doing the rounds a whole bunch. I don't tend to see Titania, but that's my little bit of spice. I love Titania in this archetype. And Nebula, this card should never have been printed, in my opinion, at her stat line. I think she's really, really strong, and this deck is doing incredibly well, and it's no surprise for me to see it performing so well. Also worth bearing in mind, these Sera Control decks often can get those 8-cube surprise wins with like a huge Hitmonkey, a well-timed Shang-Chi, something like that. This deck doesn't have that kind of surprise value really, and the fact that it's got such a high win rate really just shows you that this deck at a top level is a serious contender for best deck in the game. Here is a version without High Evolutionary, and this is a classic deck that I've enjoyed a lot in the past. It's using Sentry. You absolutely don't need the Sentry, just Jessica Jones will do the job. But the idea of this one is you've got the Sentry and the Viper, because Daredevil on turn 5 is going to show you what your opponent's doing. They might try and fill up the right location where your Sentry, where your Void is, and you can just play Professor X or Spider-Man elsewhere. But then you've got Viper onto the Void, you've got Valkyrie onto the Void. You can play the Demon or Titania alongside Valkyrie on turn 6 to win the Valkyrie lane. If your opponent's already got 4 cards in a location, you can just Valkyrie your Nebula lane, if there's 4 cards for your opponent there, and then your Nebula's going to grow to help you win the Valkyrie lane. Just a really solid deck, can't go wrong. Definitely, though, the version with High Evolutionary is significantly better, so do bear that in mind. Okay, cool. Moving on, Lockjaw. Lockjaw has really come out of nowhere. With High Evolutionary, it's incredible. In fact, it's the deck I got to Infinite with, and it is my favorite deck I've played so far this season. I've got a full video coming on that very, very soon. We're going to look at 3 different Lockjaw decks. One with... well, let's start off with the best one. This is the best one in my opinion. This is normal Lockjaw, and this is the version I built and got to Infinite rank with. Dracula and Jubilee are the stars of the show. This Hulk is like a mini Infinite, right? It's often 18 points. In fact, with this deck, you never play a card on turn 1 or turn 2, so your Hulk is going to be minimum 16 points. Dracula, Jubilee then have great options on Hulk, Infinite, Chavez, and Odin, and Jane Foster even, not so bad. The Doctor Doom is in here just because it's a good card with Lockjaw. You can Odin it in some niche circumstances. You've got the Thor, Jane Foster, and Wasp package, and the Wasp is just ridiculous in this deck because it's got that +2 points on its on-reveal ability with High Evolutionary. You're able to cycle it a whole bunch into your Lockjaw lane and then play Jane Foster to draw it again. It just goes crazy how good this deck is. Your Dracula can low roll by hitting High Evolutionary, by hitting cards like Doctor Doom, but so often it is going to be hitting the Infinite, the Hulk, the Chavez, and it's going to be winning you 8 cubes because your opponent is not going to expect that Dracula to play for as many points as it often does. Well, we have 2 more versions of Lockjaw. We have what I would say is the second best version, or maybe tied best, which is Thanos. You can't really go wrong with Thanos decks. Many different ways to build them, but often they're going to look very, very similar to this, with a Sunspot to soak up a bunch of the early energy, and a Wave to play either on turn 3 to ramp into something. Not forgetting, of course, you also have the Green Stone, the Time Stone, which you can play on turn number 3 if you miss Lockjaw to ramp into Blue Marvel, Dino Leech, something like that. And the Wave is a great option on turn 5 in this deck as well, because of course it's meaning that everyone can only play 1 card. Thanos decks often can cheat out lots of big stats early on. This is going to be great then to play Doctor Doom into your Lockjaw on turn number 6. You're just going to really struggle to lose. So I would say that if you do have High Evolutionary, the best High Evolutionary version of Lockjaw is without Thanos. And if you don't have High Evolutionary, the best version of Lockjaw is with Thanos. Here's a High Evolutionary deck with Thanos, which I'm going to be uploading in the next couple days as well. It's pretty okay, it's pretty decent, but I would say the other 2 versions of the deck are better. Mainly because, as I mentioned, the Wasp is like the biggest payoff in this one. And as soon as you're putting High Evolutionary into your deck, you've got a 17 card deck. So the Hulk and the Wasp are more difficult to draw, more difficult to play consistently. And therefore, that's why I would avoid playing High Evolutionary Thanos. Okay, moving on. We have the 3rd best performing deck, and it's Bounce, 52% win rate. Bounce is pretty extraordinary. It does have 2 big weaknesses. That is Leech and Wave. But they're honestly not the most popular cards right now. Of course, Lockjaw decks can play Leech, but they tend not to at the moment. And also, they're not seeing that many Waves doing the rounds anymore. Here is the best Bounce deck. I wouldn't really change anything here ever. You've got Chavez for that little bit of consistency early on, but the Kitty Pryde, Collector, Angela combo just goes crazy. Of course, the Bast is phenomenal. What more can I say? It's just a great deck. Can't go wrong. Highly recommended. Okay, the next best deck is Galactus. Oh my goodness. Now, the Galactus deck that they've suggested here, I think I kept the same. I still don't own the bloody card, as you can see. Wolverine, for me, is the main question mark in this one if I was to play it. Wolverine obviously gives up that you're Galactus very early on, so it's a card that you might want to consider not bothering with and maybe replacing that. If you guys play Galactus yourselves, I'm sure you know your favorite builds, but this looks great to me, apart from maybe the Wolverine, which I also think is more than fine. Galactus nerfs do look like they are on the horizon. We're going to look at 3 more decks. We have Sera Surfer. Ladies and gentlemen, why are we still insistent on calling these decks Sera Surfer? Because I think Sera is really pretty pants in these decks, particularly with Wave being quite not that popular, but I think Wave is going to increase in popularity as we move forward. And I have just built my favorite version that's been the same for months, which looks like this. Just a bunch of 2s, a bunch of 3s. Sera's fine. I wouldn't recommend it. If you don't have Jeff, you could replace Jeff for Sera, I would say. Rogue is also a card that you could consider not playing. Depends on how many ongoing cards there are in the meta. But there's quite a few. It's pretty solid. Quite a few Dinos, quite a few Dark Hawks, quite a few Patriots. So Rogue's solid, but she's the most replaceable card. Just for another 3-drop, Mr. Fantastic is going to be the card there. And again, if you don't have Jeff, I would slot the Sera in. But Sera is so bad against Wave, I just can't really bring myself to play her at all anymore. And I never liked her. The biggest upside of her before was she was good against Wave on 5 because you could still play 2-3 drops on 6. But now she just is so bad against Wave, it hurts. Okay, moving on. Shadow King's also actually pretty good, by the way. Shadow King is a card I'm going to experiment. So maybe instead of Rogue, you can play Shadow King. It's good against Kitty Pryde, Angela, Hit Monkey. Well, that's about it. Also the high evolutionary cards like Nebula, Sunspot, but also like the Hulk. There's quite a lot of cool stuff you can do with it, so bear that in mind. We have Stature up next. I would not change the standard Stature deck. I don't own Stature, as you can see here. This version, I think, is just the locked-in, most solid version. If you don't have Jeff, don't panic. It's actually not that good. I think Jeff is quite overrated. Just slot in another 2-cost card. Probably not Lizard. Like, Lizard would be the kind of go-to card before, but just something that plays for decent stats that costs 2 energy. You could also just put in something like a Sunspot, something like a Nightcrawler instead of the Jeff if you don't have access to it. Okay, up next, Discard. And Discard is a deck which I think is pretty underrated. I think it's pretty solid. My favorite version of Discard is the same one that I shared a few weeks ago, which is playing Nebula, it's playing the Collector, and it's playing Storm. Of course, one concern you might have about playing Storm is there's a lot of Storm decks doing the rounds right now, like these lockdown decks, which have things like Cyclops, maybe Doctor Doom to put in there later. But Nebula, Morbius, Collector, Dracula, all of these cards are great into the Storm location, so I think you just want to be going for that. You want to win one lane with Storm, and then you want to win one lane with pure unadulterated points with things like Apocalypse and Modok. Fun deck. Finally, the last deck we're going to look at is the Patriot Lad deck. We'll have a little skim through of the other decks that are performing well with the data, but these are really the top ones for me that we're seeing a lot of. This is using Iron Lad. I also think a lot of these decks aren't actually particularly well built or well refined. This is the one that I put together. It is based off what I've seen a lot of people doing well in tournaments. Invisible Woman and Cosmo are the 2 money cards in this one to improve the win rate of the deck. Why? Well, this makes it very strong against Enchantress decks, and we've seen that Sera Control is super popular. I think this deck is much, much better than the data would suggest because of these 2 cards. If you have an Invisible Woman down and you have Patriot and Mystique behind it, you're laughing. A lot of people also cut Mystique because if you Iron Lad the Mystique, that is a pretty big low roll, but there is no way you ever want to cut Mystique from a Patriot deck. That is absolutely ludicrous. Just high roll with your Iron Lad, hit the Onslaught, hit the Doom, hit the Iron Man, hit the Patriot, and you can't really go wrong. And absolutely extraordinary deck when it high rolls. Again, Iron Lad hitting Brood. Each of your Broodlings are going to be 6 points. Pretty ridiculous. If you don't have Iron Lad, you can still play Patriot. It's going to look more like a standard list. You probably don't need to change that much, but the Iron Lad's going to come out. The Iron Man will also come out, and you're just going to probably add in things like Misty Knight, Shocker, those kinds of things. Maybe an Abomination instead of the Iron Man as a nice card to play on turn number 5. We're going to take a little scan through some of the other decks, which according to the data are performing well. We've got a Destroyer list here, which is Not got many games at all, but doing okay with an Orca in there. This deck looks pretty average to me. I wouldn't recommend it. We have some kind of Destroy Deadpool deck looking like it's doing okay. Destroy decks in general, obviously the Venom buff, still something I want to experiment with a little bit more with Nimrod in particular. I think Nimrod is going to be the key to these archetypes. Obviously Death got buffed recently, which is quite cool. We have a Thanos Zoo deck. Thanos, I think, is being pretty underrated based on the data because there's so many different builds. Lots of people have been trying out High Evolutionary. I would avoid it. Just stick to the one that I shared earlier. I think it's the best way to go. Electro Ramp actually not doing too well with a less than 50% win rate. This list here, I believe, is Spyro's version with Black Widow Wave, where you can play like Black Widow Wave and then something like Odin on those cards, because then you give your opponent another Widow's Bite and stop them drawing. Of course, you can just play the standard Sandman stuff. Yeah, I would say that Electro Ramp is probably better than people give it credit for as well. A lot of the time, really, the snapping is very important with these decks, and people don't tend to snap too well. People don't snap when they have Sandman. They maybe don't retreat enough. I honestly think that like a lot of the data of decks like this, you can't read into too much, because the skill ceiling with some of these decks, like, it's not difficult to play Electro Ramp, so therefore the skill ceiling is pretty much 99% based on the snap and retreating. Maybe not quite 99%, but yeah. Anyway, Thanos Death. I'm surprised that a lot of people still like this. I think this is similar to what Lammy was playing, who's very good. I don't understand why you would want to play Death in a Thanos deck now that Wave doesn't work. I just don't rate it at all. Dark Hawk in the C tier, not looking too hot. Maybe this is because of the popularity of Enchantress right now in Sera Control. Seems like it's struggling. We've got a She-Naught deck. This is where you play Magic on 5. You have a Moon Girl earlier on, and then you can play Infinite plus 2 She-Hulks on 6. Not doing too well. Some kind of Nebula generic deck here with Storm, Spider-Man, Professor X. This looks similar to a Lockdown deck without the High Evo. Cerebro 2 performing quite well, also with Luke Cage and Hazmat. We have Mr. Negative doing quite well. Pretty cool to see. This Mr. Negative deck looks absolutely abysmal. The Collector with... well, this is just a weird deck. This is why we're not taking too long. Hela. Now, actually, I want to talk about Hela because the new card today, Living Tribunal, has come out. High Evolutionary also has some synergy with this deck because you can just play the Wasp for decent stats. You can play the Hulk. And the Living Tribunal, which splits all of your stats across all 3 lanes, actually seems like a really nice addition for Hela. So Hela might actually be better than it's been before. Shuri looks okay. As you can see, we're not spending too long on these because most of them kind of suck. Some kind of... I mean, I don't really want to talk about these. Doom Wave, when Wave doesn't exist anymore. Thanos Control, these decks are kind of legit with like Spider-Man, Professor X. You're still going to want to put the Lockjaw in there though. On Reveal, not looking good. Standard Patriot struggling. Again, I would definitely say that this deck could be better with an Invisible Woman with a Cosmo added in there to protect you from Enchantresses. Cerebro 3 looking okay. Something I also wanted to check out with the Invisible Woman edition, but I would certainly recommend playing Professor X, Spider-Man. Those are going to be 2 really good cards with Cerebro 3. And then there's a few other decks. We can see Living Tribunal with very low game volume making an entrance into the game. Agatha and some kind of Nebula deck as well. But yeah, really just the ones that I've shared my versions of are the ones to focus on. Just because a lot of you will be interested in seeing how it looks if we search instead by including Infinite Rank, or perhaps even let's just look at Infinite Rank only. We can see pretty much all of the same decks looking like they're doing quite well. Dark Hawk actually performing a little bit better into the B tier. Also Shuri into the B tier. Pretty interesting to see. And somehow Hela even sneaking in there as well. But yeah. Probably the best one to look at is like 70 to 99 because that's when all the people are tryharding. That's what the comments tell me. I personally actually think there's quite a lot of use of looking at people at Infinite Rank as well. And you can see here if we look at 70 and 100, a lot of the same decks still looking pretty good. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching this long. See you on the next one.